Chapter 3, Goddess of the Left Bank. For all Sarah Bernhardt's stubborn pride, her enforced resignation from the leading theater of France was a bitter blow. Her family, who during her term there had made little effort to attend her performances, thought her conduct had been disgraceful. They, and all her acquaintances for that matter, kept repeating, "One does not walk away from the Comédie Française," until it sounded like sing-song. For nearly 4 years she was in the situation which jobless actors, as a sop to their wounded self-esteem, call being available. She was restless, footloose, and anything but fancy-free. It was probably about this period of her life that she started taking on lovers. It seemed the thing to do. To her there was nothing immoral in such behavior. After all, her mother and aunt had hardly set her an example of shining virtue. They had even at one time discussed training her for their gainful but precarious profession, at which she could never have been a success. She possessed none of the requisite qualities for a grande courtesan. She would never have developed a kept woman's sense of maneuvering, nor calculated submission, any more than she could have followed the advice of Tante Rosine, herself an expert at keeping her keeper, who exhorted her to remember that a lover is a lord and master. It's a lucrative form of slavery. Sarah Bernhardt could have been a slave to no one. Her lovers might have given her jewelry and other expensive gifts, even occasional funds, but she never took one on for mercenary purposes. Moreover, her liaisons were not primarily with men of wealth or influence, but with persons of distinction in intellect or creative activity. For any idle drifter, no matter how rich or of how exalted a social position, she had nothing but the utmost contempt. To her, an affair was a matter of the mind and heart. At least she pretended to the lucky man, and doubtless to herself, that such was the case. And she may well have pretended, for a few of these fleeting adventures meant very much to her. She has been called a female Don Juan, but the lists of her amours have been grossly exaggerated. Possibly her first lover was Emile de Caratry, an officer of hussars, a gentleman who was at home in politics, the best clubs, and the court circle. He was good-looking and amusing, and had the added attraction of an irresistible uniform. After a brief liaison, she and Caratry remained good friends. Caratry remained good friends, as she was to become with many of her subsequent lovers. Even at 18, Sarah Bernhardt was not one to waste much time on amorous dalliance. Acting was her life's purpose, and she was determined to make a success of it. She had given herself a tough assignment. Everyone in town knew about her assault upon Madame Natalie. Further stories about her outbursts of savage temper had gone the rounds, and no manager would have anything to do with her. Eventually, through some wire pulling on the part of her godfather, Regis Loveley, she was able to land a job at the Gymnase, a popular boulevard theater, which under a clever director named Montigny was presenting a series of highly successful lightweight comedies. The atmosphere at the Gymnase was as frivolously fashionable as the comedy had been solemnly traditional. Backstage, the cast talked gossip and paid scant attention to the Bernhardt girl. She understudied the two leading ladies, Blanche Pearson, a blonde beauty, and Celine Montalland, a luscious brunette, both of whom, though hardly older than she, were already launched on their way to stardom. Blanche Pearson, in particular, was to become one of the most popular actresses of Française. Sarah appeared in two inconsequential comedies in which she was hardly noticed. As before, it was off stage that she gained public notice. The setting was at the court of the Tuileries, the occasion a reception for some visiting royalty. As entertainment, the imperial chamberlain had asked Montigny to send in a group of the Gymnase, which to give a recitation before their majesties and guests. Each to give a recitation before their majesties and guests. The kindly Camille Doucet, who had been instrumental in getting young Bernhardt into the Theatre Française, and who still believed in her talent, had requested Montigny to include her in the group. For her bit in the performance, Sarah had picked out 2 poems by Victor Hugo. To recite Victor Hugo before the Bonapartist court at that time was the equivalent of what today would be reciting Karl Marx before the colonial dames. Hugo was a highly controversial figure, a hero to the liberals, anathema to the imperialists. Violently outspoken in his opposition to the existing regime, he was living in self imposed exile on the island of Guernsey, writing his scathing denunciations of the emperor and calling his fellow citizens to revolt against the papier mache empire. Sons of France, was his cry, you elect who suffer for the patrie. His poems were brought out in Paris under the title of Les Châtiments, the chastisements, which the authorities did their best to suppress. A pamphlet in which he satirized the reigning colorless Bonaparte as Napoleon le Petit was actually banned by the censor, which meant that forbidden copies sold by the hundreds. Sarah, who at the age of 19 knew as much about politics as she knew about higher mathematics, had no remote idea of the implications her selections might convey. She merely thought Hugo's poetry was pretty and very moving. When her turn came, she stepped onto the platform, made her reverence, and started Oceano Nox, a turgid lament about the sailors drowning at sea. At her announcement of the poem and its author, the emperor and empress froze and remained frozen. The members of the court also dutifully went into deep freeze. Sarah thought their silence was due to the sadness of the subject and blithely announced a less tragic number, Fuelles de automne, again by the proscribed exile. Without giving her a chance to start, Napoleon rose, offered his arm to Eugenie, and walked out of the ballroom, followed by court and guests. Sarah, in complete bewilderment, stood stock still, but not for long. The stage manager in charge of the gymnase group descended upon her and, grabbing her brutally by the wrist, vented on her such a tirade of invective and blasphemy the crystal pendants of the giant chandeliers fairly jangled. According to Louis Verneuil, he was cut short by the appearance of a distinguished-looking young man, handsome as the day, who in a voice of ringing authority demanded that he let go of the girl immediately and shut up. He would not, he declared, tolerate anyone using such vile language in the presence of a lady, especially a young and pretty lady. He turned out to be Prince Henri de Ligne, scion of the noble Belgian family. After silencing the stage manager, he kissed Mademoiselle's slender hand and departed. It is a pretty account, maybe spurious, of Sarah Bernhardt's initial encounter with the future father of her child. The young actress's final appearance at the Gymnase was Un Mari qui lance sa femme, a silly comedy by Ernest Labiche, author of The Italian Straw Hat, and Raymond Deslandes, author of Nothing Noteworthy. In this, she played a giddy Russian princess named Dumchinka, a role in which she had to dance, skip, sing, eat, giggle, and behave in a generally idiotic manner. Her performance was embarrassingly bad. Unfortunately, Julie Bernhardt happened to attend the show that night. She was horrified to think that people in the audience might realize she was the ingenue's mother. Her only comment as they drove home that night was, "My poor child, you were ridiculous as your absurd Russian princess." Sarah was plunged into despair. Alone in her bedroom, she brooded over the prospect of suicide. She went so far as to run up to Madame Gerard's flat to ask Mon Petite Dame for some laudanum. Needless to say, the dear startled lady refused to give her any. Back at her open window, she stared down at the paving blocks below, contemplating a death leap. These morbid speculations were cut short by the unexpected appearance of Dumont Perret. He had been present at her lamentable stage performance, had sensed her state of desperation, and had felt a sudden compulsion to go talk to the girl before she did anything rash. Realizing she was on the verge of a complete emotional breakdown, he is said to have told her she must cut her stakes for the time being and start off immediately, that very night, for some other country, preferably Spain. It was the sort of reckless decision which appealed to Sarah's spirit of adventure. She scribbled a note to Montigny, telling him not to expect her at the theater any more, winding up with "Have pity on a poor crazy girl." Victorian Sardou, who was to become the almost exclusive Bernhardt playwright for many years, was in Montigny's office when the note was delivered. With a snort, Montigny passed it over to him. "What's this?" said Sardou. "The little madcap who slapped a sociétaire. She's very amusing." "Perhaps," growled Montigny, "but not for the managers." In her memoirs, Sarah Bernhardt said that she did set forth for Spain then and there, determined to change her course of life and perhaps marry a bullfighter; that in Spain she encountered bandits and was befriended by the vice consul and his lady, who gave her letters to the fashionable set in Madrid, where she was wined and dined and escorted by grandees to corridas, a colorful narration with a suspiciously Manchurian flavor. Munchausen. Munchausen flavor. Munchausen. Maybe she did go to Spain. Most biographers agree that wherever she went, she ended up in Belgium. Her granddaughter says that the very night of her decision to escape from Paris, the elder Dumas put her on a train bound for Brussels, armed with an introduction to some friends named Bruce. Lizzie Ann Bernhardt's report of her first encounter with Henri de Ligne is even prettier than Verneuil's. She claims that they met at a masked ball given by the Bruces. Sarah costumed as Queen Elizabeth, the prince gotten up as Hamlet. There was the usual operetta scene and a conservatory to the accompaniment of distant music. Deline entreated her to take off her mask, and she coyly refusing. At the finish of the final waltz, he is said to have handed her a single perfect rose, its thorny stem wrapped with his own fine lawn handkerchief, which, upon later inspection in her hotel room, she found bore an embroidered coronet and below it the letter L. The next day she rode in an open victoria down the fashionable Avenue Louise, wearing a billowing gown, a wide-brimmed winter halter hat, and pinned to her lace fichu the perfect single rose, on a gleaming purebred, who should ride up and rein in alongside but the handsome Hamlet of the ball. He dispatched his groom to fetch his runabout, into which he lifted the blushing Queen Elizabeth, and drove her directly to the palatial house in the Avenue de la Toison d'Or, which he shared with his family, who most opportunely opportunely had gone for a month to their country estate. Across the events of that day and ensuing ones, a velvet curtain is discreetly drawn. Lizzie Ann Bernhardt reprints a letter written to the elder Dumas by Mr. Bruce, which reads in part: "And so, my dear Dumas, your young friend, Mademoiselle Sarah Bernhardt, has conquered Brussels. At our ball she captured the heart of the Prince de L. I think they've been meeting. Do you resent my offering the girl too much to distract her from her troubles, or do you congratulate me for giving an actress a means of freeing herself from prejudice? P.S. I've just returned from her hotel. Sarah has not shown up for 8 days. It seems that she is traveling with friends. I fear these friends merge into one person and that they have not traveled farther than the Avenue de Toison d'Or. It's what happens when you let a dragonfly loose with a butterfly." The idyll, wherever it took place, was cut short by a dispatch from Madame Gerard saying that Judith Bernhardt was seriously ill with a heart attack. Sarah, in frantic concern, took the next train for Paris, concern over leaving her prince and concern for the mother who, in spite of Yule's indifference, Sarah loved with intermittent bursts of fierce devotion. She found her mother over the attack and well on her way to recovery. She also found, after a few weeks, that she herself was pregnant. She told no one. She didn't even write the news to her lover for fear he'd feel trapped into sharing the responsibility. In spite of all mounting complications, her ambitions for the stage were undiminished. She haunted the theatrical offices, in each and every one of which she tasted the bitter humiliation of being peremptorily turned down. Her shockingly unprofessional flight from the gymnase had added to her reputation of being unreliable, if not slightly demented, and most managers wouldn't even grant her an interview. None of these brush-offs weakened that spirit of the Quan. She still gave way to outbursts of anger or moments of affected bravura. But her general bearing was one of proud distinction. Someone called her a cabotine, ham actress, cast as a gypsy, but pretending to double as a pampered princess. For 5 months she was jobless. Eventually, her state of pregnancy became more and more apparent. She realized she'd have to tell her mother. Judith Bernhardt, who by now had taken on the curious bourgeois respectability of the retired courtesan, was outraged. She screamed that she would have no little bastard born under her roof, ignoring the fact that she herself had borne 3 little bastards, each by a different father. She ordered her sinful daughter to get out of her home, and the sooner the better. Sarah found a small flat in the Rue Dufault, for which she departed, taking Regina with her and leaving no address. The mother was glad to be rid of the 2 of them. She could now lavish her full attention on Jean. Madame Gerard also moved into the Rue Dufault. There, on December 22nd, 1864, attended only by her faithful Mon Petite Dame, the 20-year-old actress gave birth to Maurice Bernhardt. Soon after, too soon for the good of her health, she started forth to find work for the support of the baby she adored. Her funds were depleted, and although Madame Gerard helped out as best as she could, it was not enough. A job finally came up at the Porte Saint Martin, a theater specializing in melodramas and extravaganzas, which were of a superior quality due to the clever producer-director Marc Fournier. It wasn't much of a job. She played parts which were practically walk-ons and understudied the other actresses. A break came with La Biche au Bois, B-O-I-S, a musical billed as a vaudeville freak with scenic effects as pretty as a candy box, a Madame de Bay as the Princess Desiree, and a Madame Ugade of the Opera Comique as the Fairy Prince. Halfway through the run, Madame de Bay fell ill, and Marc Fournier took the risk of putting Sarah on as the substitute. It was quite a risk, as the Princess Desiree was called upon to sing a few numbers, including a duet with the Fairy Prince. Madame Ugade was a trained singer and Sarah was not, but through some vocal trickery of half speaking, half intoning the words in a manner which she herself admitted sounded at times like a provincial actress reciting Racine, she got by, and her name appeared on the bill posters. To be continued.